So just a few words on the atrocity in Kabul. Um, the latest details are that 80 people have been killed and 260 injured. This makes this the worst attack in Afghanistan for several months. So even by Afghanistan's violent standards, this one was bad. Certainly was the worst attack in Kabul for a long time. And what had happened was there was a demonstration by Hazara people. This was a peaceful demonstration to try and pressure the government to bring electricity to the impoverished Bamyan region, and they had demonstrated peacefully outside the Afghan parliament in Kabul when this blast went off. The Taliban denounced the attack and denied responsibility. Islamic State have claimed responsibility. That's not to, it's not as if the Taliban are angelic, far from it. They've been guilty of some horrendous atrocities over the years, but once again we see the barbarism of ISIS. And it looks like what may be happening is that as they lose ground in Syria and Iraq, which is of course to be welcomed, they're pushing into other areas, whether it be trying to inspire attacks in the West, such as the atrocity in the East, or attacks like this. 2015 was a very bad year for Afghanistan. The number of civilians being killed last year really went high. Some figures suggest the death toll all round last year was 37,000. Now, that of course can't be verified. It might be significantly lower than that, but whatever the figure is, it is true that the situation in Afghanistan has escalated. It's very, very difficult to know what the best foreign policy approach to this is from the point of view of NATO. Obviously, NATO countries intervened in 2001. It's less controversial in Iraq because it had a wider UN sort of mandate, but it's very difficult to know what the right approach is because if the Americans and the British and the other coalition forces completely 100% pull out, as I understand it at this stage, there is some troops on the ground, but not the sort of numbers that were there in the late 2000s. But if there's a complete withdrawal, then it's under the Afghan National Army. Now, the thing about Afghanistan, of course, it's known as the graveyard of empires. There's a very strong and understandable um, nationalism in Afghanistan because this is a country that is it's dirt poor, but there's a real national pride there from defeating greater or more powerful powers, whether it be the British Empire during the Hindu Kush expeditions in the 1840s, whether it be the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and most recently, well, I was going to say most recently the United States and its coalition allies, but that would be misleading because then we assume that the Taliban own Afghanistan, bearing in mind that the NATO intervention was on top of the Taliban era in Afghanistan, 1996 to 2001. Um, One thing I do get frustrated with in these situations is sometimes it's presented as country versus the intervening powers. That's not. It's really not that straightforward. With Iraq, some differences, but I think the thing is, then you're kind of presenting ownership of Afghanistan to the Taliban, which enslaved Afghanistan for 5 years. Um, but this is always the situation or the debate focus. You're weighing up hideous human rights abuses, a barbaric regime or dictatorship on one hand, versus the fallout from intervention on the other. Now, I don't believe in a containment approach of, well, it's terrible, but we can't do anything about it. But I also do think that we do need to evaluate military intervention as a foreign policy approach, and it has been perhaps too frequent in recent years. Now, what Tony Blair said was that one of the problems in the 1990s was not intervention, but lack of intervention. There were major conflicts in the 90s, and the main criticism was not that the West intervened, but the West didn't do enough. Take, for example, the Rwandan genocide and the Srebrenica atrocity. To this day, Srebrenica, the Dutch are blamed for not protecting the Bosniak Muslims who were killed there. And yet, when it comes to Iraq and to a lesser extent Afghanistan and Libya, all the West are warmongers. So I really think that If you take an anti-Western position, that's fine, but you need to be consistent in what that position is. So you cannot, on one hand, criticize the West for not acting to save civilians, whilst on the other hand, criticizing the West for doing precisely that, intervening. Um, I do think that a country like Afghanistan, which is very difficult to nation build from scratch, and I know I'm going off the a little bit, I'm covering broader issues here than today's atrocity, but there isn't much more to say about it, except the Hazara people have got a history of persecution. It's disgusting what ISIS is doing, and I think it is fair to say at this point they are the most brutal terrorist organization in history. They have long surpassed Al Qaeda in that regard, in terms of the depths of their depravity. And there's been many brutal terrorist organizations throughout history, and I'm not talking about state terrorism. I'm talking about militant terrorist groups that are acting outside of a state. Of course, there's examples of state terrorism as well, but that's for another video. Um, so I'll just leave it here. My thoughts are with the victims. There is this debate about, oh, why does the Western media not show the same attention? It's interesting that people make those complaints on CNN, on the BBC, on Channel 4, and that is exactly Western media reporting it. I think one theory is that sadly there is a situation in countries like Afghanistan where the violence is so frequent that you simply cannot make a big thing out of every single atrocity. Now, this is getting more attention than usual because of the scale of it. But if 10 people are killed tomorrow, it won't make news. And I don't think that's saying that the lives being taken are not worth the news. It's just that when it becomes so frequent, it is very difficult for an editor practically fit all of that in. If an editor of a news network was fitting in all the world's atrocities out of fairness, then he or she would have to fill an entire news segment with nothing but mass murder. Because at any one time in the world, you have huge bloodletting going on in Syria, in Nigeria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. They simply cannot cover everything at once. So I don't quite agree with those who say there's some sort of conspiracy theory about. In the end of the day, why shouldn't British news or French news or American news focus on atrocities that are happening in Britain or France or America? Why not? If we were to listen to Arab or a Persian or an Afghan network, they would obviously be dominating in these sort of stories. So it's all down to relativism and what your perspective is. Speaking personally, I've shown my little bit of solidarity. I've changed my Facebook profile to the Afghan flag. I put links to the story to sort of spread awareness. Um, I mean, personally, I don't. I even without letting that account for the victims, and it's obviously isn't going to help them. It's not like that. It's just a little my personal gesture. I just feel it's the right thing to do. Um, the thing about this is, I think they're getting more desperate. ISIS. That's both good and bad. It's good because it looks like they are finally the tide is turning and they are being pushed out of everywhere that they are. On the other hand, a cornered dog is very dangerous, and that's why some of these attacks are getting particularly depraved. Like I say, the Hazara people have been persecuted before. In Kabul, Ashraf Ghani, President Ghani, has ordered Afghan flags across the country at half mast. Um, but in a lot of failed states, there is an institutional problem of sectarian persecution, and there's no escaping that fact. It's like the persecution of the Ahmadis in Pakistan. Um, this is a reality. So the so-called Islamic State is once again just shown that they're sadistic thugs. So my thoughts are with all the victims. That's just information about today's atrocity in Kabul. And I hope they could be pushed out of Afghanistan, hopefully by the Afghan National Army, because then, no one can accuse the West of having a colonialist agenda. If it's done by the Afghans, then it's done by the Afghans. But in the end of the day, this is a poor country. They need the arms. And those, a quick word, this is important actually. when we talk about arms dealing, it's always done in a very Machiavellian, dark sense. There are times I believe there is a moral case for arms trading when you have a situation whereby civilians are being murdered en masse and the government lacks resources. Then there is a moral argument to be made for arms trading, and there is a historic precedent for this, such as the Spanish Civil War and other examples throughout history. So it's not always a case. This is why I get a little bit annoyed with hippy dippy pacifists, because their view of the world is kind of like black and white. And they, my question to them would be, well, if your answer is pacifism, how do you take on ISIS? Do you sit down with a cup of tea and say, let's just settle our differences, and then cave into their demands and look at what the demands are? I mean, it's not that the Afghan government is a world leader in human rights. We're talking, this is all relativism, but there's there's very few organizations or bodies that get much worse than Islamic State, so called. And these Daesh scumbags just need to be wiped off the face of the earth, as far as I'm concerned. They're a plague on humanity. Thanks for watching.